This is the fifth in a series on Ralph Miliband's Marxism and Politics. This video covers the third section in Chapter 6, Reform and Revolution. This section covers the search for new institutional forms and Miliband's own revolutionary strategy. Miliband asks a question asked by many leftists over the years. Would the ruling class ever allow a radically anti-capitalist coalition to take power? Or would a preemptive strike be launched? Miliband considers a few possibilities. There might be a coup. It wouldn't be the first time. There might be a backroom deal. We've certainly seen that before. But there's another possible answer. Namely, that a preemptive strike by the right is not a foregone conclusion. Assuming that a radically anti-capitalist party or coalition does take power, what should it do? Well, what are the options? Let's review the choices Miliband has laid out over the course of his book. First, Marxists were distinguished from liberals. The Marxists' political goal is social revolution, that is, emancipation of the working class and an end to class conflict. You'll recall that liberals took a different view of conflict, not as something to be ended, but as something to be managed between parties that more or less want to get along. The UK Labour Party has certainly had liberal members. It's also had openly Marxist members, like Ralph Miliband. The U.S. Democratic Party, on the other hand, well, there aren't any openly Marxist Democrats I'm aware of, despite what the right has been saying for literally the better part of a century. As Frank Llewellyn of DSA said in 1999, we would have a very different politics if there actually was a powerful bloc of socialists in Congress. Miliband then distinguished two Marxist revolutionary strategies. The way he put it was, there are Marxists who believe that the emancipation of the working class requires the smashing of the existing bourgeois democratic state, and there are Marxists who believe no such thing. We've been calling these two traditions Leninist insurrectionism and constitutional reformism. The former was the official line of the Third International, although it was not carried out outside Russia. The latter was the line of the German Social Democratic Party, once it moved beyond the orthodox Marxism endorsed by Kautsky and others and mutated into what was called revisionism. To the right of these Marxist traditions are parties of social reform. Their defining characteristic is that they are not anti-capitalist, although they occasionally wring their hands over this or that conspicuously inhumane feature of the capitalist economy. The difference between insurrectionist and constitutionalist Marxism is not between violent transition and peaceful transition. Extreme stress on a state may lead to its collapse. The state may also be smashed constitutionally and without bloodshed. Miliband says of the insurrectionist tradition that it is a project which envisages the total transformation of the existing political institutions, that is, the smashing of the state, as an integral and essential part of a socialist revolution. Regarding constitutionalist Marxism, Miliband, Ralph Miliband, the quote on this slide is from his son Ed, says, it is a project which envisages the carrying through of a socialist transformation by way of the main political institutions, notably Parliament, inherited from bourgeois democracy, even though these might be, to a greater or lesser extent, reformed in more democratic directions. When the socialists win electoral power, what can we do? How likely is it that a reformist party of revolution becomes, once in office, a party of order. Miliband says, left critics of the reformist strategy have usually argued that the answer to this was not much. The reformist leaders would not seek to implement the program on which they'd been elected. The self-proclaimed party of revolution would turn into the party of order, and in due course it would be thrust out of office, with the old order more or less intact. Compare this narrative with that of Marx's 18th Brumaire, which narrates the events leading up to Louis Napoleon Bonaparte's abolition of the French Republic and the establishment of the Second French Empire. This is when President Bonaparte proclaimed himself Emperor Napoleon III. The case can be made, and is made by Marx, that radically different institutional forms are needed. Marx wrote, "The working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes." He also wrote, "Between capitalist and communist society lies a period of revolutionary transformation. There is a corresponding period of transition in the political sphere, and in this period, the state can only take the form of a revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat." What does it mean for the state to take the form of a revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat? We'll deal with the revolutionary part in a moment, but first, what is meant by the phrase dictatorship of the proletariat? I thought it was reasonable to ask, well, what does Russian Wikipedia have to say about this? And I found an answer that's very different than what some might expect. It says, dictatorship of the proletariat, in Marxist theory, is the most democratic of all existing forms of political power, based on self-government councils consisting of delegates or deputies elected by workers, usually at meetings of labor collectives, which are controlled by workers, are responsible to them, workers can give orders to their representatives, and at any moment can be recalled and re-elected by the same voters, if they do not express their interests, thereby ensuring the collective power of the proletariat as a social class. At the same time, the councils simultaneously exercise legislative, executive, and judicial powers. So, at least according to one crowdsourced website, dictatorship of the proletariat means, basically, democratic government by working people through self-government councils. There's even a case to be made that what is meant is self-sovereignty of the working class, government of, by, and for working people. But that's literally a whole other slideshow about early modern political philosophy. In my opinion, though, it's clear that in certain contexts, when a socialist says dictatorship, they mean it. They mean an entity that has the right to do as it pleases. But crucially, this right is a collective right. Neither Marx nor Lenin ever argued that there should be a dictatorship of one man. Lenin wrote instead of the dictatorship of a revolutionary class. Government of, for, and by working people. That would certainly be a radical change from what we have now. It would mean the end of the state as we know it. But in order to make the change stick, a new state needs to come into being. In the small r republican revolutions of past centuries, once the monarch is deposed, the first step is to create a provisional government. As soon as you smash the state, you immediately have to set up a new one. Gramsci wrote that the Marxist state would typically be proletarian, and in it, the social life of the worker and peasant class would become a system, universal and strongly organized. And Miliband points out that in the dictatorship of the proletariat, in the meaning which Marx may be taken to have given to it, or which Lenin gave to it in 1916 through 1918, it is always popular power which is stressed, and it is its exercise by the proletariat and its allies which is glorified. That power is exercised almost directly and only mediated by representative institutions strictly subordinated to the people. Lenin thus writes that the state, under these conditions, is transformed into something which is no longer the state proper. Lenin wrote in 1917, the Soviets made it possible to combine the advantages of the parliamentary system with those of immediate and direct democracy, that is, to vest in the people's elected representatives both legislative and executive functions. Luxemburg demanded that the proletarian mass must fill all governmental positions, must control all functions, must test all requirements of the state on the touchstone of socialist aims and the interests of its own class, self-sovereignty of workers. The problem with smashing the state as a revolutionary strategy, according to Miliband, is that a time of revolution of the Leninist kind is precisely when the dictatorship of the proletariat is least possible, because such a time requires the recreation of a new and strong state, a state proper, on the ruins of the state which the revolution has smashed. He cites Gramsci as follows. In its proper Marxist meaning, the notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat disposes much too easily, and therefore does not dispose at all, of the inevitable tension that exists between the requirement of direction and of democracy, particularly in a revolutionary situation. Luxemburg didn't resolve the question of direction and democracy either. The structure she proposed, Miliband writes, was, very reasonably, to be capped by an executive council as the highest organ of legislative and executive power. But suppose now that the state is not smashed, and the anti-capitalist left takes power, backed by a majority, and decides to carry through far-reaching anti-capitalist measures, including fairly drastic measures of nationalization, imperative economic coordination and planning, major advances in labor legislation, social welfare, education, housing, transportation, and the environment, all favoring the lower income groups and with fiscal policies directed against the rich. What then? The conservative forces, Miliband points out, will soon be reorganizing themselves for the destabilization of a hated government and its ultimate undoing. In this task, they will have the precious assistance of powerful capitalist governments and international capitalist interests. The government has only one major resource, namely its popular support. But this support, expressed at the polls, has to be sustained through extremely difficult times, and it has to be mobilized. The party supporting the government will no doubt do this, or try to do it, and other working class organizations, like unions, will play a part. What is required, however, is something very much larger than can be provided by such organizations, namely, a flexible and complex network of organs of popular participation operating throughout civil society and intended not to replace the state, but to complement it. This is an adaptation of the concept of dual power, in that the organs of popular participation do not challenge the government, but act as a defensive/offensive and generally supportive element in what is a semi-revolutionary and exceedingly fraught state of affairs. This is Miliband's revolutionary strategy, a reformist Marxist strategy, taken seriously and pursued to its necessary conclusion, namely, a vast extension of democratic participation in all areas of civic life, amounting to a very considerable transformation of the character of the state, and of existing bourgeois democratic forms. Miliband proposes not that we try to replace the state or smash it, but rather that we bring an end to class division through the mobilization of a network of organs of popular participation inside and outside of government. For lack of a better term, we could call Miliband's revolutionary strategy dual power constitutionalist Marxism.